Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Radnor Memorial Library. My name is Pam Sidor. Thank you all for coming. I can see John has a lot of friends and readers too. Look at this gorgeous book. This is John Dobbyn's brand new book, High Stakes. And let me tell you a little bit about John. He was born and raised in Boston. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Boston College Law School. Prior to entering law school, Dobbyn served in the Air Force as radio and radio director of aircraft in the Air Defense Command. After practicing law for several years as a trial lawyer, he obtained a Master of Law degree from Harvard Law School and subsequently accepted a position as professor of law at Villanova Law School. Law professor and mystery writer, Dobbyn's short stories have been published in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. He's the author of two previous Knight and Devlin novels, Neon Dragon and Frame Up. I'd like to say that this evening we have books for sale. This is brand new, hot off the press, and Nick is here from Main Point Books. He'll be selling books. And Vince is here from Studio 21, serving Radnor Township and Lower Merion Township. So please welcome to Radnor Memorial Library, John Dobbyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam. Beautifully.
Thank you. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much. Hey, good evening. It's great to see you. Before we begin, I promised that I'd check with you to see if the sound's all right. Sound is good. Okay, in that case, I mean it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Boy, it's great to see you here. You know, everyone I look at is a friend. This is like being in our living room, isn't it, honey? I'll tell you, this is, and I appreciate your coming out in the middle of the night here. Like this. Can I tell you something I've noticed? I think, and I have a feeling that everybody who has ever written a novel would agree with this. There is one question that is, by the way, can you all hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, good. Let me know if it shuts off or anything. One question I think is asked more than all of the others put together. And the reason is, it's a good question. And the question is, how do you get your ideas? And the answer is, and actually I think I have an answer, and the answer is they come from Him. I really firmly believe that it's a gift from God. I really believe that. And I'll tell you why. Because every morning, right after Lois and John and I do the crossword puzzle, and we do it with the help of Alexa, if you know who Alexa is, I have no shame about that. I sit down at a blank screen. And when I sit down to that screen, I have absolutely no idea what kind of a mess I'm going to get Lex Devlin and Michael Knight in that day. Absolutely no idea. And I have even less idea how I'm going to get them out of it. But I have absolute faith that the ideas are going to flow, that they're going to come. And I got to tell you, in 30 years, it has never failed. I'll give you an idea, give you an example. 2 years ago, I needed a theme for this next novel. It's got to be about something. This novel, High Stakes. Oh, by the way, if I could embarrass my bride one more time, I got to tell you something. I absolutely love that title. It has at least 3 depths of meaning in relation to the novel itself. I love it, and I can say that because I didn't write it. It came from the one who has given me all of my titles for 6 novels, and that is my wife Lois. I got to tell you, if it weren't for Lois, I would have 6 novels with absolutely blank covers. Anyway, I needed a theme. And it had to be a grabber, because if I'm going to spend 2 years researching and writing this novel, if it isn't absolutely fascinating to me, then I'm going to drive myself nuts writing it. I'll tell you exactly how it came. For 8 years now, Lois and John and I have spent the week between Christmas and New Year's at a beautiful place called the Playa Conchal in Costa Rica. And there's a sweet little waitress down there. Her name is Jennifer. She works at a restaurant down there. And a couple of years ago, she came up to our table and she said, you know, I've known you folks for years, and I know you're from the United States. But where in the United States are you from? I said, we're from Pennsylvania. She said, good heavens, are you vampires? You get the connection. Pennsylvania, anyway, we get home a week later, and son of a gun, I open my emails. First email that I get is an offer for a Viking river cruise. And this particular cruise wound up in Romania, and it included a tour of, guess where? Transylvania, Dracula's kingdom, and in particular, Dracula's castle. So that's 2 nudges in an odd direction in 1 week. So Lois and I, we took the hint, and we took the cruise. And we traveled through Transylvania. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the research for this novel. We drove through the Carpathian Mountains, which are gorgeous beyond description. We walked through every inch of Dracula's castle. We even slithered through these little tiny tunnels that are carved into the stone in the castle. And I'll tell you, for a fellow with a serious case of claustrophobia, that's once and never again. We went to a monastery. It's on a little island in Snagov in Romania, where we stood over the tomb of the human Dracula, not the vampire. Anyway, by the time we finished that tour, I was absolutely fired up by 3 ideas, and they were this. First of all, I was amazed that it surprised me that there actually was a human, non-vampire Dracula. And he lived 45 years, from 1431 to 1476. He went by the name Vlad Țepeș Dracula. Vlad Țepeș means Vlad the Impaler in Romanian. Dracula was actually a title of honor. His father had been inducted by the Holy Roman Emperor into the Order of the Dragon, which was a crusader group. And because of his courage in battle, Vlad the father was given the title Dracul. Dracul means the dragon. It also means the devil in Romanian. His son Vlad inherited the title, but it became Dracula, which means son of the dragon or son of the devil. Second thing that surprised me was that there was a direct connection between this human Dracula, who lived around 1460, and the fictional vampire who was made world famous by Bram Stoker when he wrote the novel some 400 years later. Bram Stoker, incidentally, Bram, I didn't realize this, Bram is short for Abraham. He did the research for his novel by traveling through the same parts of Transylvania that we did. And his vampire, Dracula, was actually based on a legend that had grown up around the real human Vlad Dracula. Actually, when Lois and I were standing over that tomb of the human Dracula, this is the story that we heard. And that tomb, by the way, is like a shrine to a saint. In fact, the whole monastery is built in memory, dedicated to his memory. This is the story. Around 1460, this Vlad Dracula became the ruling prince of a large province in Romania. It's called Wallachia. It's a province just south of Transylvania, which is where he was born. This prince ran a tight ship. For example, there were no jails, there were no prisons in Wallachia, and there was no need because he had no enemies alive. If anyone were the remotely feared to be disloyal to the prince, then it meant absolute death by his favorite method of execution, which is he would impale them on a 10-foot stake. And that's actually where the vampire legend began. Prince Vlad had developed his own personal method of impaling, and he did it so that it never touched any of the vital organs of the impalees. And his victims just died from the loss of blood. When they died, he had them taken off the stake and thrown in the local river. They floated downstream. And remember, this is about 1460. So think of the villagers downstream, the superstitious villagers downstream. They pull these bodies out of the river. They find that they're totally drained of blood. There are no visible wounds, except for this one hole in the neck where the point of the stake came through. What do you suppose they dreamed up? Got to be a vampire upstream. And who is the vampire? It must be Prince Vlad Dracula. And that's where the legend started. And over the years, the legend got filled in with little extras. For example, you can ward off a vampire by holding up a cross. You can also ward off a vampire by wearing a clove of garlic around your neck. Where that one came from, I don't know. Anybody remember what's the only way you can kill a vampire? With a wooden stake through the heart. And a vampire only attacks his victims at night. More of the legend. Why? Because a vampire can't go out in the sun. He will shrivel up and die. Or at least he'll lose all of his powers. So what does he do? During the day, he hides in a coffin. And he usually sleeps on a bed of soil from his native Transylvania. So, 400 years later, 1897, when Bram Stoker went to Transylvania to do his research, this whole legend was completely laid out for him. And what he did was he took the legend, he transformed it into the classic novel Dracula, and he did it well. That term, classic novel, that's a technical term actually. You know what that means? Or wouldn't this be the dream of any novelist? It means that for the 120 plus years that novel has been out, it has never been out of print. That means people have been buying it for 120 years. The third thing that surprised me was this, and this is what turned it into the theme for the novel. In the 120 years since that novel was written, literally hundreds of vampire novels, novellas, short stories have been written based upon that same vampire character of Bram Stoker. It's been made into movies, literally hundreds of times. Before 1928, it was made into dozens of silent movies. And then in 1931, probably the most famous Dracula movie of all came out. Anybody know who starred as Dracula at that time? It was...
No, Boris Karloff.
Bela Lugosi, absolutely, right on. Thank you, Bill. It takes a dean to remember that. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi, by the way, was an interesting character. Bela Lugosi was Romanian, and he was fiercely Romanian. He was so Romanian that he refused to learn any other language, including English. So when he came to the United States and was playing came to Hollywood and he was making films, actually he was just reciting his lines phonetically because he didn't speak the language. But a number of people played it. Jack Palance played it in 1973. Wonderful actor, Frank Langella, played it on Broadway, and then he played it in the movie in 1979. In 1992, I think the best of them all was made, and it was made by a wonderful director, Francis Ford Coppola, who made, I think, the second best crime movie that was ever made, The Godfather. He made it with Gary Oldman starring as Dracula. As a matter of fact, I just saw it recently. A couple of weeks ago, it was about 1:30 in the morning, and I was just cruising around the state looking for something to put me to sleep. And Turner Classic Movies was playing Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. So I watched it, and I got to tell you, I have two recommendations for you. Number one, I recommend you see it if you ever get a chance. It's a terrific movie. Number two, but don't do it just before you go to sleep. That was the longest night I think I've ever spent. It was made into a television series. I remember in our neighborhood, you never called or visited a neighbor in the mid-'60s when Dark Shadows was on. Yes. There's a character on Sesame Street that's taken from... There's even a cereal, for the love of Pete, called Count Chocula. Given all of that play on Bram Stoker's Dracula, 10 minutes ago, if I had just said the one word to you, Dracula, I would bet my Corvette. I would bet something else. That the only thing it would bring to mind would be the vampire. In other words, this fictional vampire has so completely upstaged the real Prince Vlad Dracula that the real one has practically disappeared from history. And the deeper I got into the research, the more amazing that was, because in his time, when he was the Prince of Wallachia, this real Prince Dracula was absolutely the most famous, or the most infamous, depending on which side you were on, ruler in all of Europe or Asia. Let me tell you a couple of stories about this fellow. I found him absolutely fascinating. In 1456, Vlad Dracula was made the ruling prince of the province called Wallachia in Romania. Almost all of the land in the province was owned at that time by individual, powerful, wealthy aristocrats. They were called boyars, B-O-Y-A-R-S. And each boyar had his own fortified palace. He had his own army. And these boyars were constantly at war with each other, so that the net result was the only rule of law in the province was absolute anarchy. All of the previous princes, they always had princes. They did have a ruling prince, always. And every one of them was assassinated, and they were assassinated in rapid succession. So when Vlad Dracula became the ruling prince, he thought, son of a gun, I'm going to send a message that perhaps will get their attention. So he put on a great show. He invited 200 of the most powerful, wealthy boyars and their families. He invited all of the wealthiest merchants and their families. He invited 5 bishops, and he invited the archbishop to a magnificent Easter celebration. And he held a grand banquet in the throne room of his castle. And according to one report, as the guests were eating, Dracula looked out at them and watched the arrogant expressions on their faces, because he knew that these folks out there were the ones who had assassinated all of his predecessors, including, by the way, his father and his brother by burying him alive. So when the dinner ended, Prince Vlad made what they called an unusual speech. It was unusual because all of the previous princes had simply been the stooges of the boyars. But he asked them, he said, "My loyal subjects, how many reigns of princes have you personally experienced in your lifetime?" Now remember, those are the folks who had assassinated all of these princes. That actually brought laughs from these arrogant boyars. But when there was finally a moment of silence, one of them yelled out, "7, my lord." Another one said, "I've survived 30 princes." Another one said, "Since your grandfather, no less than 20 princes, and I survived them all." Prince Vlad knew that what they were saying basically was, all of your predecessors have been a collection of dummies, and as far as we're concerned, you're the next one in line. At that point, in the words of a report of the time, quote, Vlad Dracula's eyes began flashing in a way that was to become characteristic. The prince gave an order. His attendants surrounded the hall. 200 boyars and 200 merchants and their wives and their children and their attendants, something over 500 in all, were immediately impaled in a circle around the castle. The message went out, did it not? He got their attention. It went out to all the other boyars, it went out to the merchants, it spread all across Europe, it spread across Asia. You don't mess with Prince Vlad Dracula. Over the next 6 years, and he was not assassinated. Over the next 6 years, one Greek historian commented that the number of boyars and merchants and their wives and their children, down to infants, in other words, of his own people, whom he ordered executed in his favorite way, reached over 20,000. There's a story about one brave boyar, as a matter of fact, and he had to be brave, who dared to tell Prince Dracula, he told him, "It is a sin to kill the innocent children." So Prince Vlad took him out on a sunny day, took him out to a stony place. Prince Vlad kicked over a stone with his foot. A viper, a snake, and all of its babies rushed out and started slithering around the legs of the boyar. The boyar grabbed a stick. He killed the snake, and then he killed all of the baby snakes. Prince Vlad asked him, "Why did you kill the baby snakes?" And he said, "Well, Your Highness, the baby snakes will grow up and then they'll bite." And Prince Dracula said, "And so do I with the children of my enemies." This was one tough son of a gun. But I'll tell you, tough as he was, he could appreciate a bit of humor, and a whole lot of kissing up was not lost on the good prince. He was once entertaining a Polish nobleman. He'd come as an ambassador from a very powerful king of Hungary, King Corvinus of Hungary. And after dinner in his throne room, Prince Vlad's servants brought in a 10-foot solid gold spear, and they set it up right in front of the ambassador. The ambassador, believe me, was aware of the prince's hobbies. Prince Vlad asked him, "Why do you think I had that spear set up here?" And the ambassador said, and I bet it was with a prayer, "Perhaps some boyar of your country has offended you, my lord." And Prince Vlad said, "No, no, no, no. You are the representative of a great king. I had it set up especially in your honor." Now that had to be a tough moment. I would have lost it right at that moment. The ambassador, on the other hand, had it together enough to say, "My lord, if I've been responsible for something worthy of death, then do as you please, because you are the best judge. And in that case, you would not be responsible for my death, but I alone." Now that had to be a nail-biting moment, right? You know what happened? The prince broke out laughing. He absolutely loved the answer. It was cute, it was clever, and it was a heavy quantity of kissing up, and it got the ambassador off the hook, I guess literally. But to leave absolutely no doubt, Prince Vlad said, Had you not answered me in exactly that fashion, I would have impaled you on the spot. This is one tough cookie. Let me stop here for just a moment. So, now I got to this point in my research. Let's stop there for a second. If we were to pass judgment on this ruler, Prince Vlad, at this point, we might say what? Paranoid? You betcha. Egotistical? Sadistic? All three absolutely in the extreme. And by the way, I haven't touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of, neither here, believe me, I'm not going to do it here, and I don't do it in the book. I haven't touched any of the really creatively, horrendously sadistic things that he did, mostly to his own people, as a matter of fact, and I got to tell you, with a great deal of enjoyment. As a matter of fact, this Prince Vlad Dracula was reputed to be the model for the Marquis de Sade, from whom we get the word sadistic. And yet, this Prince Vlad was, Lois and I found, did we not, honey? By the Romanian people, he's absolutely revered as a saint. If not a saint, then absolutely the next thing to a saint. So at this point in my research, I've got a serious question. How in the world can you both be an accomplished sadist and a saint at the same time? So I thought, hey, there's got to be something on the plus side. There's got to be something good about this fella. So I started looking on the other side of the ledger. And for one thing, I found that before Prince Vlad became the ruling prince in Wallachia, there was absolutely nowhere in the province that you could travel without being robbed, kidnapped, beaten, murdered. There was absolutely no law in the province whatsoever. As soon as he took power, the very first thing that he did was he sent his troops out. And the orders were to find and impale every thief, every kidnapper, every murderer. And as a matter of fact, impale anyone whom the prince even considered dishonest. And I got to tell you, it was effective. It's an effective way to rule, because it was a very short period of time before you could travel from one end of that kingdom to the other absolutely, totally safe. There was a story about the fact that the prince actually left a solid gold cup beside a public water well in the middle of his city. That cup was often used. It was never stolen. There's a wonderful story. I love this story. It's about a merchant who came into his province. And this merchant knew the reputation of honesty for everyone in the enforced honesty of everyone in the province. He left his wagon open at night, left it out in the open, and it contained a sack containing 160 ducats. These are gold coins. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. The next morning, he came back and he found the sack had been stolen. So he immediately went to the prince and he reported the theft. The prince did two things. The first thing he did was he promised the merchant, tonight you will have your gold. The second thing he did was he issued an ultimatum to the people of the city. And the ultimatum was this: find the thief or I will destroy your city. And they knew he meant it. The prince was so absolutely certain of the result that he had 160 of his own gold coins plus 161 gold coins placed in the merchant's wagon. The thief was caught. Well, you can imagine, with that price on his head, the thief was caught, yeah. And can you imagine what happened to him? I bet you can guess that too. But when the merchant counted the coins, he found that there were not 100, there was 161 coins there. So immediately he made the correct choice. He went right back to Prince Dracula and he returned the coin. And when he did, Prince Dracula pointed to the impaled thief and he said, had you not returned that extra coin, you'd be right up there with him. So you got to give him a few points for honesty, right? And honesty's good, nothing wrong with honesty. But again, this fellow was revered as a saint. There's got to be more to it, I figured, than honesty. So I kept looking. And oddly enough, the next thing I found was that this fellow was intensely, are you ready for this, religious. He was intensely religious. He was obsessed with fear for his immortal soul. He lived in a time when they believed that good works would eradicate sins. I'll give you an example. He suspected at one time that his mistress was being unfaithful to him. Can you imagine the bravery of that woman? Anyway, it didn't last long because you can probably guess exactly what happened to her. But then, when she had passed away in the usual way, he made sure that she had the last rites of the church. And he staged an elaborate, full Christian funeral for her at his expense, a prince of a guy. So actually, the question comes down to this. The good deed at the end, does it outweigh the sin of murder? There was a time when he had a particular political enemy, and his name was Vladislav II. He actually was the previous ruler of Wallachia. He came just before Prince Dracula, and Prince Dracula killed him. He did it personally with his own hands. As a matter of fact, that's how he became the ruling prince of Wallachia. He created the vacancy and he filled it. But in order to cover his bets for his immortal soul, for the afterlife, he built and endowed a beautiful monastery on the exact spot of the killing. Matter of fact, it's still there. You can still see it in Transylvania. So again, the question, does the good deed, does the monastery outweigh the killing? And the answer is, that's up to him. That's beyond me. That's up to God. But it still seemed, if it does, even if it does, doesn't that seem still a little minor when we're talking about sainthood? So I kept looking, and then I found the answer. Then I found the reason that this fellow has been buried as and renowned as a saint. In his life, Prince Vlad was actually known as the savior of all Christianity. The rescuer of all Christianity. That was a shock, but it's no joke. In the 1450s, Sultan Mehmed II of the Muslim Ottoman Empire was rapidly conquering. He was gobbling up large chunks of Christian land. In 1453, after a 2-month siege, he actually conquered Constantinople, which was the seat of the Christian Roman Empire. He killed or enslaved all of the Christian people who lived in that city. The city became totally Muslim, changed its name to Istanbul. The next step would have been the conquest of Venice, and then an easy sweep across all of Christian Europe. The Pope at that time, Pope Pius II, saw this as the most major threat to all of Christianity. There was a council at that time, the Council of Mantua, 1459. The Pope made a desperate plea to all of the leaders of the Christian countries in Eastern Europe. Please come to my join my crusade against the Sultan. And all of the Christian leaders pitched in with their very best wishes and absolutely nothing else. There was only one who came to his rescue, and that was Prince Vlad Dracula. And he did it in 2 ways. First, he pledged an enormous sum of money, and he paid it. But more importantly than that, he gave him military support. He had a force, he had an army of only 10,000 men. And as I hear the army described, it sounds to me very much like George Washington's army before Valley Forge. This is just a rough-hewn collection of farmers with guns. But nonetheless, he led, Prince Vlad, at the front of the line, he led his soldiers into battle, and he reconquered all of the land in his province that had been previously conquered by the Sultan. Took it all back. And believe me, that bugged the Sultan. The Sultan did not take that well. And as a matter of fact, the Sultan then personally led his entire army, and now we're talking about 150,000 well-trained and well-armed soldiers in one major drive to conquer all of Prince Vlad's province. We're talking about, look at the odds, 150,000, 10,000. Prince Vlad fought him in 3 ways, the only 3 ways that he could fight him. First thing that he did was he led his army in a deliberate retreat north. And the idea was he wanted to draw the Sultan and his army into the Carpathian Mountains, where the prince thought he would have better territory to fight. And as they retreated, Prince Vlad personally led nightly raids on the Sultan's army. And in doing so, he managed to kill or capture a large number of the Sultan's troops. Second thing that he did was this retreat was the ultimate scorched earth tactic. Every time Prince Vlad would lead his army through a town or a city, they would destroy everything. Every scrap of grain was taken. Every living thing, pigs, goats, cattle, everything was killed. Every drop of well water was poisoned. So when the Sultan and his troops came after him, By the way, in the heat of the hottest and the driest summer on record, there was absolutely nothing, not even water, to support the troops of the Sultan. Third thing that he did was interesting. During that time, some of Vlad's troops came down with diseases, and I mean diseases. I'm talking about leprosy. I'm talking about the bubonic plague that had come across from China on the Silk Road. What Vlad did was he had his soldiers who had contracted these diseases dress up in the Turkish uniforms of the captured Turkish soldiers, cross the line, go in and mingle with the Sultan's troops. And they did. And as a matter of fact, it was a very short time before those diseases started spreading through the Sultan's army. And that was all of that was effective, but the Sultan kept coming. Remember, we're dealing with 150,000 to 10,000. What really stopped the Sultan cold, absolutely stopped him cold, sent him retreating back to his fleet on the Danube and then across the Black Sea back to Turkey without a fight. And therefore, what ended the threat to Christianity was something that only Prince Vlad Dracula could have done. When the Sultan followed the prince in his retreat through his capital city, Turgovista was the name of it. He followed him through the city, which at that time was a wasteland. Prince Vlad had left it as a wasteland. But when he came through the north part of that city and came out on the north side of the city, he came into a long valley. And when they came into that valley, the Sultan and his troops, but particularly the Sultan, saw something that absolutely destroyed his will to fight. Picture this. For over 2 solid miles, over 2 miles through that valley, there was a double column of impaled bodies. Most of them the soldiers or officers that had been captured from the Sultan's own army. Total number was estimated at more than 20,000. One historian reported that when the Sultan saw this, he was just completely overcome. He, in his words, "I could not win the land from a man who could do such things. If he can do this, there are worse things that he could do." Sultan retreated without a fight, Threat to Christianity ended. The Pope gave the very highest honor to Prince Vlad Dracula. And as a matter of fact, the other leaders of the other Christian countries just sent floods of tributes, floods of prizes to Prince Vlad. For what? For nothing less than saving all of Christianity. So now I could understand why this fellow, regardless of everything else that he did, I could understand why, in spite of that, he was given the burial of a saint. And that, all of that I found, as I'm doing the research, I find this, golly, this is amazing. But then, looking back on it, I found that it was even more amazing that in spite of all of that, as I said at the beginning, if I just said to you the word Dracula, the only thing that you would bring to mind is this vampire. And that struck me as odd, because if comparing the two, Prince Vlad, who accomplished all that, and this fictional vampire, the former, to me, is far and away the more interesting. And it seemed to me that there is, somewhere in there's a theme for a novel. But that presented two very immediate problems, and problems that I had a terrible time getting over. One is, in these novels, I do not use violence. I don't use vivid violence. I kill people, but I do it in a non-violent, well, not in a non-violent way. I do it without describing the violence. As a matter of fact, I frequently kill people off screen, and then the bodies are found later on. In other words, I want to give you in a novel, I want to give you all the suspense that I can pack into it, but I will not give you nightmares. So if that's the case, how do I avoid the grisly violence of this Prince Dracula? Second problem, I guess, is the obvious one. Fascinating as this Prince Vlad was, for the love of Pete, he lived in the 1460s. How do I bring him into contact with, my two lawyers that are walking the streets of Boston today? And that's when I believe that God gave me the answer here. It was roughly, I don't remember the date, it was roughly 2 years ago. But I remember the time. The time was exactly 3:15 in the morning. I woke up out of a sound sleep. I think I yelled out loud, "Son of a gun, that's how I'll do it." I brought Lois 2 feet off the bed, I think. Here's the idea. During his rule, Prince Vlad Dracula extracted fortunes in taxes from the wealthy boyars and from the merchants and so on. He also received an absolute river of tribute from rulers of other countries. As a matter of fact, from the Sultan himself before they became enemies. And I'm talking about gold, silver, spices, gems, jewelry, artworks. In other words, when he began his retreat from the Sultan, Prince Vlad had in his capital, Turgovista, a treasure that is beyond any of our imaginations. It was also too massive for him to take with him on the run as he was retreating from the Sultan. So, and when the Sultan marched through his city, Turgovista, where the treasure was supposed to be hidden, Sultan never found it. And heaven knows, Prince Vlad's castle has been gone over inch by inch, and it was never discovered there. And that was the connection I was looking for. That treasure has never been discovered. Thank you, Lord. That was the chance to bring an interesting bit of history, fascinating to me, a bit of history, into a current battle for the treasure among three organized crime gangs, all three of which are currently operating in Boston. And interestingly enough, all three of which have historic connections to that era of Vlad Dracula. We're talking about the Russian mafia, talking to the Chinese mafia, basically the triad in China and the Tongs in the United States, and the Romanian mafia. And so all I had to do to create a novel is take my poor little, suit and tie, unarmed lawyer, drop him into the crossfire and get him to survive so there'll be another lawyer. And basically that's how the theme for the story developed. Before I quit, I've got to tell you, if you've got one more minute, I just got to tell you an interesting side note. This one just came up fairly recently. Lois and I went to a writers' conference. It's called the International Thriller Writers Association, and there was a conference in New York. And some wonderful writers come from all over the world to that, thriller writers, basically. We ran into one in particular. We had a chance to spend some time with him. His name is J.D. Barker, and J.D. has just written a biography of Bram Stoker. And he wrote it with Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew. And his great-grandnephew had, in order to provide to the partnership, he had Stoker's personal handwritten diary, his journals, and a number of his personal writings that were right out of the mind of Bram Stoker. And what I was absolutely amazed to hear is that when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, the novel Dracula, he actually believed that the entire legend about the vampire was true. He believed that it was fact. He did not write that as a novel. He wrote it as a true story, vampire and all. And he wrote it to warn Londoners that there are vampires among you, and, take care. The publisher that he brought it to, Constable and Company, refused to publish it unless he cut the first 131 pages from the novel. Those are the pages in which he made it absolutely clear that he was speaking the truth and this is not fiction. Now remember, this is, the publisher said, we'll publish it, but only as a novel, only as fiction. Why? Well, remember, this is 1897 when this novel came out. London was still very much on edge from the murder, the grisly murder of 5 prostitutes by Jack the Ripper. You remember that? And Jack the Ripper had never been caught. So what the publisher was afraid of is setting off some kind of a mass panic in London if this came out, much like was produced by Orson Welles when he remember the War of the Worlds? Well, they were afraid that the same thing could happen. So Bram Stoker now is put to a decision, isn't he? Does he stick to his guns, in which case nothing's going to be published, or does he cave in, eliminate the pages, call it a novel, and get it published? And I guess he thought half a loaf is better than none. So he finally agreed, we'll call it fiction just to get it published. But he did it in the hopes that you and I who read it, and it's a wonderful novel if you've never read it, it's marvelously written, but he hoped that people who would read it would read between the lines and realize that it is all true, and they would take the warning. I've read this book, Dracul. It's marvelously written, this biography of Stoker. And it actually tells about Bram Stoker's contact with the vampires. When Bram Stoker was a child, up until the age of 7, he could hardly get out of bed. In fact, most days he was too ill to get out of bed. But he had a nana. He had basically a nana. I guess that explains it. And this nana was very close to Bram Stoker. There came a time when he was just about 7 years old, still terribly ill. Finally, he was in extremis, and so they called in a doctor of the time, and the doctor said, "Oh, the only thing we can do is bleed him." So they put these leeches all over and so on. Nana could not stand it. She burst into the room, told, and this is out of Bram Stoker's writings, everybody out of the room, all leave the room, left her alone with him. And now in his writings, she simply bent over him, put her teeth into his neck, and he passed out at that point. And when he woke up, he was completely healthy. He got out of bed, he walked around. As a matter of fact, he and his sister, the first thing they did was to go down to Nana's room, and they looked in Nana's room where she slept, where she'd go there every night. There was a layer of dust on the floor. There were no footprints. When they walked, there were footprints, but there were no footprints. They looked under the bed, which had never been slept on, but they looked under the bed, and there is a layer of dirt, a layer of soil. Remember a layer of soil from Transylvania? So he finally came to the conclusion this was absolutely a vampire. From the age of 7 until he was into close to the time that he died, he could not even catch a cold. He could not catch a cold. If he was injured, he would have an operation. For example, he had an appendix. The following day, the scar had totally healed. These are the facts that come out in this biography. This is not fiction, at least it's not written as fiction, of Bram Stoker. I got to tell you, you read that thing and it will give you the creeps. It is very persuasive, but persuasive as it is, and in spite of our sweet little friend Jennifer, who is very much afraid that we're vampires, right? I think I can tell you from the heart, there are no vampires in Pennsylvania. But what do I know? I'd be happy to answer any questions that, yes, sir.
Where did you find all this information? There's no Dracula Memorial Library, I presume.
No, there is, but there should be. No, there isn't. But there has been a lot written on it. And where did we find? You know what the primary source was? Believe it or not, Transylvania. When Lois and I went there, early on in that trip, I became aware that this was more than fascinating. This might work its way into the next novel. So we did everything we could to gather every scrap of information that we could, based on, what is the legend and where did it take place. We went to the monastery where he was buried. We saw Dracula. We did everything we could in order to, make it real.
Is there a lot of stuff written?
Yes. Actually, there is. Most of it is oral. A lot of it is oral, and that we picked up in Romania. Other than that, there are books. I've read books on it and done research. As you know, the internet is wonderful for getting the names of airports. How far is this airport from that airport, and so on. But for the heart and soul of it, really, we got it right in Transylvania.
Thank you.
Yes, Vince?
What did Dracula die from? Old age?
His father. What did his father die from?
No,
Oh, Dracula. Dracula died in combat. Sometime later. He was the prince for 6 years. Then he was out of office for a period of time, and then he came back into office for about 6 months. He led his army on a campaign when he came back, and he was killed in battle during that next term. Yes, babe?
And he took his horse with him.
He
was
did.
going to be killed, so he didn't want them to torture his horse.
That's right. The horse is buried with him, by the way, in that.
Chapel.
Yeah. Do they have horse saints? Any? Yes.
It might be gruesome, but how did he actually impale people?
Oh, I don't want to tell you. That's an excellent question, but that would guarantee you nightmares. I could tell you. I'll tell you afterwards. Okay. But yeah, I'm seeing some nods. It was a very effective way, but believe me, you don't want to hear. Most of you don't want to hear it. Anybody have a question that's not about not about torture? Hey, well, if
How long have you been writing, John?
how long have I been writing?
Your novels?
You know, it actually started, Lois and I both came from Boston, and I'll make this brief. But Lois and I both came from Boston to teach at Villanova. And after we'd been here a few years, in our neighborhood, which is Valley Forge Mountain, tennis among the women became a big deal. So Lois wanted to take tennis lessons. And so the best place was the mainline night school. So I wanted to take her to the, and be with her and so on. But what am I going to do while she's hammering tennis balls? So I looked at the catalog, and the only thing that was vaguely of interest was a course in creative writing, taught by a wonderful woman, Gertrude Berg. She was a wonderful Newell Award winner of writer of children's. Well, anyway, she gave an assignment, and again, I didn't really care for I was just killing time. But she gave one assignment, and the assignment was to write 5 paragraphs on the 5 senses, like a walk in the woods. You smell the birds, you hear the trees, whatever. And that sounded relatively boring. So I decided, just for the fun of it, you know what I think I'll do? I think I'll write a very short mystery story, and I'll make the detective a blind criminology professor. So he'll have to use the 4 senses, in order to. I didn't care about the course anyway, so I thought, what the heck? It's like our students, Bill. You remember if they didn't know the answer to the question we asked, they'd answer their own question in the hopes we wouldn't know. Right. Anyway, she didn't care either, but she did like the story. And she suggested I send it to a magazine, which turned out to be Mike Shane's Mystery Magazine. And son of a gun, first jump out of the box, they bought it. And it was a complete fluke, because I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know the first thing about writing a story. But they bought it. Actually, they went out of publication about a year later, and I claim no credit. But anyway.
So many lawyers have a background in starting out maybe as an undergrad as an English major.
Right.
And then they go on to law school.
Right.
And then, because you have to have that facility, you must know the English language.
Absolutely.
If you're going to stand up in court and just continue to
do
a lot of writing. So you didn't write
I
Harvard.
avoided writing at every turn. Anything I could avoid that had anything to do with writing, I would avoid. Until this. And once that first short story sold, you're hooked. It's like a fish on the line. And then I started writing short stories, and one after the other, and one after the other. Rejection slips started pouring. We got enough.
While at Villanova.
While I was teaching. We got enough rejection slips to paper our house. There was a time when I had a feeling, when I dropped that manuscript into the mailbox, as we used to do, there was somebody at the other end at the same moment dropping the rejection slip at that end. It was that bad. And one of them that I was sending it to was Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, which is supposed to be, as they say, the world's leading mystery magazine. I figured if I'm going to get a rejection slip, it should have some class, right? And that had some class. But after about the 5th rejection slip, I got it back, and as I opened it, and I'm reading the same form, but son of a gun, the editor, God love her, Eleanor Sullivan, she had handwritten in the margin, "Don't quit, you're getting close." Can you imagine when? And so I sent the next one I wrote, and I really put my heart and soul into the next one. She bought the next one. And then she bought the next 22. And then Alfred Hitchcock's magazine bought the next 5. And but then you reach the point where you actually have to climb, no more foothills. You got to climb Mount Everest and write. And you go from writing a story you can tell in 6,000 words to one you have to spend 95,000 words telling. And I'll tell you, that is daunting. And where do you begin? How do you get hold of this massive words? Well, anyway, basically that was it.
Fatal Odds.
Actually, the first one was the middle one, then Neon Dragon.
Okay, Neon Dragon.
Right.
Them all upstairs.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Good.
High stakes is checked out.
That's sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, and then Neon Dragon.
2 years ago, Fatal Odds, that was the
Okay.
last one.
Right. Well, there were 6 in all. Neon Dragon is about the Chinese Tong in Boston. The next one was Frame Up, and Frame Up is about international art theft and art forgery. The next one was Black Diamond. All these titles came from Lois, by the way. Black Diamond she gave me before I wrote the novel. She said, "What's your next novel going to be?" I said, "Maybe horse racing." She said, "I've got a name. Black Diamond, that's the horse." That was horse racing. The next one was Deadly Diamonds, and that was about the rotten diamond industry. especially the blood diamonds of Sierra Leone. And then then Fatal Odds. That was the last one 2 years ago, and that's about this horrible, the second most profitable activity of every organized crime gang and every terrorist organization in the world. And that is, you won't believe it because nobody knows it, the illicit trade in endangered wild animals. It's right. Every year, dozens of whole species go extinct by virtue of this trade. Anyway, that's what that book was, and a great deal of that was to make people aware of what's going on. And then finally,
Wonderful.
Any other
voila.
questions for John? John, thank you so much.
Thank you, Devlin.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam.
Good
Thanks,
luck. Good luck.
Thank you, hon.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Nick is here from Main Point Books, and if you'd like to purchase a copy, John will be sitting over there with Nick, and he'll be signing your books. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful. What a fantastic talk, and very timely. Here we are approaching Halloween. And you didn't plan that, did you?
Oh, yes.
Oh, you did. Okay. See, he's an expert in marketing.
Lois is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.